The year is 476 AD. Marcus stands on the marble steps of what was once the greatest forum in the world, watching smoke rise from the 7 hills. Behind him, barbarian warriors drag golden statues through streets that once echoed with the marching boots of invincible legions. The air tastes of ash and fear. He doesn't know it yet, but Marcus is witnessing more than the end of an empire. He's watching the death of civilization itself and the birth of something darker, something that will plunge Europe into 1,000 years of shadow. But how did the mightiest empire in human history crumble so completely that its collapse would reshape everything we thought we knew about power, knowledge, and survival? Tonight, we witness the moment when light died and learn what crawled out from the ruin. I'm always curious where you all are listening from, so drop a comment with your location and what time it is. They love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to explore from empire to darkness, the collapse that created the evil world. Close your eyes and imagine Rome at its height. Not the ruins you've seen in photographs, but the living, breathing colossus that dominated the known world for over 1,000 years. Picture streets wider than modern highways, paved with stones so perfectly fitted they needed no mortar, stretching hundreds of miles, carrying fresh water to cities of 1 million souls. A feat Europe wouldn't match again until the 1800s. Public baths with heated floors, libraries containing the wisdom of the ancient world, theatres that seated 50,000 spectators. This was the beating heart of an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the Euphrates, from the Scottish Highlands to the Sahara Desert. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, but they all looked to Rome as the eternal centre of their world. Romans believed their empire would last forever. Their historians wrote that Rome would endure until the stars fell from the sky. Their poets sang of an empire without end. But here's what chills the blood. Every senator debating in the forum, every merchant trading across the Mediterranean, every child learning Latin in Alexandria. How do you destroy a civilization so advanced, so vast, so seemingly permanent that its citizens couldn't imagine a world without it? The answer is both simpler and more terrifying than you might think, because Rome didn't die from a single it died from 1,000 cuts, each one invisible until it was too late to heal. But before we watch the empire bleed to death, we need to understand what made it sick in the first place. The rot began where it was. By the 3rd century AD, something had changed in the Roman soul. The citizen soldiers who had conquered the world were gone, replaced by foreign mercenaries who fought for gold. The senators who once debated the fate of nations now spent their time accumulating wealth while the empire crumbled around them. Imagine walking through Rome in 250 AD, the marble facade still. The streets are crowded with refugees fleeing barbarian raids on the frontiers. Germanic tribes you've never heard of are camped outside the city walls. In the forum, a new emperor is proclaimed. You've lost count of how many that is this year. Some don't even make it to Rome before they're murdered by their own guards. 50 men who claim to rule the world, most of them dead within months of taking power. This is what historians would later call the crisis of the 3rd century. But that sterile name can't capture the psychological horror of what was happening. Imagine if your president changed every few weeks, if your currency became worthless overnight, if your army consisted entirely of foreign mercenaries who might switch sides at any moment. But the internal decay was only the beginning. Beyond the borders, in the dark forests of Germania and the steppes of Asia, something was stirring. Entire peoples were on the move, driven by forces Rome didn't understand and couldn't control. The Huns were coming. Picture this. You're a Gothic chieftain. Your people have lived in the same lands for generations. They fight with composite bows, strike like lightning, and vanish like ghosts. Their leader calls himself Attila, and his warriors believe he carries the sword of the witch. Your choice is simple. Submit to the Huns or flee toward the one place that might offer safety, the Roman frontier. But Rome is no longer the Romans. The legions are weak, the borders are porous, and the emperors are desperate enough to let entire tribes settle within the empire in exchange for military service. What could possibly go wrong? Rome was inviting them in. By 400 AD, the situation had become surreal. Germanic kings commanded Roman armies. The Senate still met, the bureaucracy still functioned, but everyone could feel it. The weight of centuries pressing down, the sense that something vast and ancient was finally breaking apart, the moment when the careful balance between civilization and chaos finally shattered. But to understand what happened next, we need to meet the man who would become both Rome's savior and its destroyer, a man whose name would echo through the centuries as both hero and villain. His name was Alaric, and he was about to teach Rome what it meant to be truly afraid. The collapse. 800 years no enemy army had set foot inside Rome. The city had survived Hannibal's elephants, Celtic warriors, Germanic tribes, Persian armies. It was the eternal city, protected by destiny itself. But destiny, it turned out, had an expiration date. Alaric's Gothic warriors poured through the Salarian gate like a dark tide. These weren't the mindless savages Roman propaganda had painted them as. They were former Roman allies, men who had served in Roman armies, who knew Roman weaknesses better than the Romans themselves. Picture the moment. A Roman citizen, perhaps a senator's daughter, waking to the sound of foreign voices in her marble atrium. Through her window, she sees warriors with long hair and painted shields loading gold. The impossible is happening. Rome is being sacked. For 3 days, the Goths methodically stripped the city of its treasures. They emptied the treasury of the accumulated wealth of conquered nations. Most terrifyingly of all, here's what the history books don't tell you. Alaric didn't want to destroy Rome. He wanted to be Roman. This Gothic king had spent years trying to negotiate a place for his people within the empire. Short, he had served as a Roman general, fought for Roman causes, dreamed Roman dreams. The sack of Rome wasn't an act of barbarian rage. It was a broken promise made manifest. Rome had used these people and then discarded them. Now they were taking what they felt they were owed. But the psychological damage went far deeper than the physical destruction. Rome wasn't just a city. It was the belief that order could triumph over chaos, that civilization could push back the darkness forever. When news of the sack spread across the empire, people didn't just mourn lost gold. They mourned the death of certainty itself. If Rome could fall, what was permanent? St. Augustine, writing in North Africa, captured the horror perfectly. If Rome can perish, what can be safe? But Alaric's sack was just the beginning. 66 years later, another barbarian king would finish what Alaric had started. His name was Odoacer, a Germanic warrior who commanded what was left of the Roman army in Italy. He wanted to replace it. September 4th, 476 AD. Picture this scene. A young man, barely 16 years old, sits on the throne that once belonged to Augustus and Marcus Aurelius. His name is Romulus Augustulus. Little Augustus, just a tired old order, finally admitting defeat. You're no longer needed, Odoacer tells the boy emperor. Pack your things, and just like that, it was over. Not with a bang, not with a battle, but with administrative efficiency. The Western Roman Empire ended not in fire and blood, but with paperwork and pension arrangements. Romulus Augustulus was given a villa in Campania and a comfortable allowance. He disappeared from history, probably dying peacefully in bed sometime in the 510s, outliving the empire he had briefly represented by decades. But across Europe, millions of people were about to discover what it meant to live without Rome. The roads still existed, but there was no one to maintain them. The aqueducts still carried water, but no one knew how to repair them when they broke. The libraries still held their scrolls and codices, but there were fewer and fewer people who could read them. In Britannia, the last Roman officials sailed away, leaving behind a native population that had forgotten how to govern itself. In Gaul, Germanic kingdoms carved up the former province like a feast. In Spain, the Visigoths established their own royal courts in former Roman cities. For 1,000 years, to be civilized meant to be Roman. Now, suddenly, there was no Rome to look to for guidance, for protection, for identity. People had to choose, adapt to the new reality, or cling to the memory of what had been lost. Most chose to cling, and in that clinging, in that desperate attempt to preserve something from the wreckage, something new was born, something darker, more fragmented, but ultimately. But before we explore what rose from the ashes, we need to understand what it felt like to be alive in that terrible moment between worlds. Aftermath. Alone in the dark, the sound of wind through empty bills, small fire. Imagine you're a craftsman in Lyon, circa 485 AD. Your grandfather told you stories of Roman governors and bustling markets, of merchant caravans stretching to the horizon and coins stamped with imperial eagles. Now you wake to silence. The great road that once carried goods from Rome to the Atlantic is cracked and overgrown. At night you can hear wolves howling in what used to be suburban villas. But you're not just facing physical decay. You're confronting something far more terrifying, the collapse of knowledge itself. Your father could read Latin, do mathematics, navigate by the stars. He understood engineering principles that built those massive aqueducts and calculated tax rates for a province. But that knowledge died with him, because there was no longer any institution capable of preserving and transmitting it. Libraries rotted. Schools closed. The complex administrative systems that once managed an empire of 100 million people simply vanished. Picture Maria, a Roman citizen living in what we now call. She remembers when soldiers in shining armor marched along the roads, when merchants from Egypt and Britain filled the markets. Now, the soldiers are Germanic warriors who serve a king she's never heard of. The merchants are gone, replaced by local farmers bartering grain for tools. And the law? Because in this new world, protection doesn't come from distant emperors or abstract legal codes. It comes from men with swords who can defend. This is how the local warlords rose to power. Not through grand political theories or divine mandate, but through simple, brutal necessity. When the central government collapsed, people turned to anyone who could offer safety in exchange for service. Clovis, a Frankish king who carved out a kingdom in northern Gaul. He's not particularly educated, doesn't speak Latin well, can barely write his own name, but he understands something the last Roman bureaucrats forgot. Power flows to those willing to use violence in defense of. Clovis offers his neighbors a deal. Acknowledge him as king, provide him with warriors, and it's not a hard choice to make when you're facing winter with no protection and no certainty about tomorrow. But this fragmentation of power came with a terrible cost. The loss of connection to something larger than the immediate, the local. While political institutions crumbled, one organization not only survived the collapse but thrived within it. The Catholic Church had something no Germanic king could offer: continuity with the lost world, a connection to Roman authority that transcended military might. Bishop Augustine of Hippo, writing by candlelight as Vandal armies approached his city. He understood what was happening better than any contemporary. The city of man was collapsing, but the city of God would endure. The church became the repository of Roman knowledge, Roman law, Roman culture. Monasteries preserved libraries. Bishops maintained diplomatic contacts across the fragmented lands. Priests offered spiritual comfort in a world that had lost its certainty. But the church didn't just preserve the old world, it transformed it. Roman imperial authority became papal authority. Roman legal concepts became canon law. Roman administrative efficiency became ecclesiastical organization. In this new world, to be civilized increasingly meant to be Christian. Yet, even as these new institutions took shape, people couldn't shake the feeling that they were living in the shadow of something greater that had been lost. Many believed they were living in the last age of the world, that Christ's return was imminent, because surely God wouldn't allow such darkness to continue forever. But they were right about living in a new age. an age that would reshape European civilization in ways they couldn't imagine. In the ruins of the empire, in the desperate attempts to find safety and meaning after the collapse of everything certain, something unprecedented was taking shape. Darker than Rome, more fragmented, but in some ways more human. A world of personal bonds rather than abstract institutions, of local loyalties rather than universal. They didn't know it yet, but they were creating what we would call the medieval world. But how exactly did that transformation happen? How do you build a new civilization from the rubble of the old? The answer lies in three revolutionary ideas that would have seemed impossible to any Roman citizen. Ideas about loyalty, authority, and the relationship between the powerful and the powerless that would define Europe for the next 1,000 years. Across what was once the Western Roman Empire, something unprecedented is happening. Not the restoration of the old order. Picture a former Roman villa in what we now call Germany. The marble floors are cracked, the frescoed walls are faded, but the building isn't abandoned. Instead, it's been transformed into something no Roman architect ever imagined. The hall of a Germanic lord. They're not senators or bureaucrats, they're warriors who've sworn personal loyalty to their lord in exchange for land and protection. This is the birth of feudalism, though they don't have a name for it yet. Watch as a young warrior kneels before his lord. He places his hands between those of the older man and speaks words that will echo through centuries. I become your man for the land that you give me, and I will defend it against every man who lives or dies. This isn't a legal contract, it's a sacred bond, sealed not in courts but in the sight of God and witnessed by the community. The young man isn't just promising military service, he's pledging his honor, his life, his descendants' future. In return, the Lord isn't just granting land, he's accepting responsibility for his vassals' welfare, his family's protection, his soul's. This system seems primitive compared to Roman law with its complex legal codes and professional bureaucracy. When your Lord knew your name, when your oath bound you to specific people rather than abstract institutions, when your survival depended on face-to-face relationships rather than distant government policies, betrayal became not just illegal, unthinkable, and so across Europe they began to build. Not the grand public works of Rome, aqueducts and amphitheatres, but something more defensible, more personal. Picture the first Motti and Bailey castles rising from the European landscape. They're crude compared to later medieval fortifications, just wooden palisades on artificial hills. Roman power had been projected from the centre outward through roads and legions. Medieval power was concentrated in specific places, defended by specific people, exercised over defined. Castle wasn't just a military installation, it was a statement. This land is mine to protect, and I am here to protect it. The Catholic Church wasn't just preserving Roman knowledge, it was creating a new form of authority that transcended the fragmented political landscape. Pope Gregory the Great, writing from Rome in the 590s, articulated something that would have shocked any pagan emperor. By God's representatives on earth. This wasn't just theology, it was a revolutionary political theory that would shape European civilization for a millennium. Picture a Germanic king kneeling before a Catholic bishop to be crowned. Symbolism is profound. The warrior who commands through strength, submitting to the priest who guides through wisdom and divine connections. But the church offered something even more precious than political legitimacy. It offered meaning in a world that had lost its certainty. In monasteries across Europe, monks were doing something extraordinary. They were preserving and transmitting not just Christian teachings but the entire intellectual heritage of the classical world. The works of Aristotle and Plato, Roman legal texts, Greek scientific treatises, historical chronicles, all saved by men who had renounced the world in order to preserve its wisdom. But they weren't just copying, they were transforming. Classical philosophy was being synthesized with Christian theology. Roman law was being adapted to Germanic custom. Greek science was being filtered through biblical cosmologies. The result was something neither purely classical nor purely Germanic nor purely Christian, but something new, medieval European civilization. By 600 AD, the transformation was complete. The Roman Empire was a memory, but Europe wasn't empty. It was full of new kingdoms, new loyalties, new forms of authority, new ways of understanding the relationship between God, king, and common man. The Franks in Gaul were becoming French. The Angles, the Visigoths in Spain were merging with Roman populations to create something uniquely Iberian. Each kingdom was different, each culture unique, but they shared something fundamental. They had all learned to build new forms of civilization from the ruins of the old. But perhaps the most remarkable thing about this transformation was how quickly people forgot it had ever been different. Within a few generations, feudalism felt eternal, Christianity felt inevitable, and the complex personal bonds that held society together felt as natural and permanent as the Roman law had once seemed. They couldn't imagine that their new world was just as fragile as the one they had replaced. They couldn't see that everything they were building could, in time. Tonight we've witnessed something rarer and more terrible than the rise and fall of empires. We've seen the death of one form of civilization and the birth of another, which brings us to a question that should chill you to the bone. What if it happened again? What if you woke up tomorrow and everything you consider permanent, your government, your economy, your technology, your entire way of life, simply stopped working? The Romans thought their empire was eternal. They had technology we're only now rediscovering, infrastructure we still can't fully replicate, a legal system that governs us to this day. They controlled more territory and ruled more people. They were wrong about permanence. They were wrong about inevitability. They were wrong about the future. What makes you think we're right? Because that's the real lesson of Rome's fall. Not that barbarians can defeat civilizations, but that civilizations can defeat themselves. Not that external enemies are unbeatable, but that internal decay is unstoppable once it reaches a certain point. The Romans lost their civic virtue. They stopped believing in their institution. They outsourced their defense to people who didn't share their values. They prioritized wealth over wisdom, comfort over character, individual gain over collective good. Here's what should terrify you even more. The people who lived through Rome's collapse weren't monsters or fools. They made reasonable decisions based on the information they had. They adapted as best they could to circumstances beyond their control. They tried to preserve what they valued most. The medieval world that rose from Rome's ashes wasn't built by visionaries or heroes. It was built by ordinary people who had to choose between chaos and whatever imperfect order they could create. They chose to build. They chose to create new forms of meaning and belonging and protection in a world that had stripped away everything they thought they could count on. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your comfortable bed, in your protected home, in your stable civilization, remember Marcus standing in the ruins of the Roman Forum. Remember that every empire falls, and remember this: what comes next is up to you. The story of how Europe rebuilt itself from Rome's ruins took centuries to unfold. If you want to journey with us through the rise of Charlemagne's empire, the fury of the Viking Age, the glory and terror of the Crusades, and the slow birth of the Renaissance, shadows where our world was truly born, subscribe and join us under the torchlight. Because in the darkness between what was and what could be, the most important stories are always told. Until next time, sleep well if you can.